The 20th of April 1945 was Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. The Red Army had broken through on the Seelow Heights northeast of Berlin and was only a few kilometres from the German capital. In the west, the American armies had almost reached the Elbe and were about to join up with the Soviets, cutting Germany in two. Hitler and his entourage now were enjoying life 18 metres underground in a cramped bunker, something many Berliners who faced constant air attacks would have been very glad to have had. For everyone in the bunker, with the possible exceptions of Hitler, Eva Braun and Blondi, it must have been quite clear that it was only a question of days before Berlin was captured. The talk was of continuing the fight from the so-called Alpine Redoubt, the mountainous area based around Berchtesgaden in south. Whereas the Alps offered good defensive positions, no one seems to have considered how troops in such an area would be supplied. Nonetheless, some Nazis believed that even with Berlin in Soviet hands, they could continue the war. To this end, Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, ordered Operation Seraglio, which was to evacuate around 80 people together with huge piles of paperwork to the south, from whence the battle would continue. It was the late afternoon of the 20th of April 1945, whilst the inhabitants of the bunker were enjoying what must have been a very depressing birthday for Hitler. Sergeant Rocco Smish was the switchboard operator in the bunker. He took a cigarette break, and whilst in the garden of the chancery above the bunker, he spotted two men he knew. 20-year-old Sergeant William Arndt, who had been wounded and was now one of Hitler's personal servants, together with a younger soldier called Fers. The two of them were struggling with a large trunk, which Misch later estimated to weigh at least 45 kilos. The trunk was loaded with some difficulty onto an old three-wheeled delivery truck. The men then went back to collect around 9 more trunks. Misch did not ask what was in the trunks, and this information was not volunteered. Once the truck was loaded, Arndt disappeared for a short while and reappeared in full field uniform with a machine pistol. He was to be the escort for the delivery of these trunks. Rocco Smish watched Arndt go, envious that he was getting out of Berlin and would live to tell the tale. As it happened, Wilhelm Arndt would be dead in a few hours, whilst Rocco Smish had 68 years more of life ahead of him. Owing to the very narrow corridor still open between the American and Soviet armies, Operation Seraglio had to be conducted by air. 47-year-old General Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, was in charge. The destination was Einring near Salzburg, which was the airfield closest to Berchtesgaden. Bauer had gathered 10 planes which were located at 4 airfields. The lorry carrying Arndt and the metal trucks went around 10 kilometres to the northwest of the bunker to the airfield at Schönwalde, which was where the transport aircraft of the 14th Air Corps had been based. There must have been a very pessimistic atmosphere at the base, which itself was to be captured on the 24th of April 1945 by the 1st Belarusian Front. 2 Junkers Ju-352s were waiting for them there. This plane was the largest in the Luftwaffe, also called the Hercules. Only 45 of them were built, the project having been scrapped in September 1944. One was to be flown by an officer named Schulze, the other by Major Friedrich Gundelfinger. Gundelfinger was an experienced pilot and had served throughout the war, mainly on the Eastern Front. As the 20th of April 1945 was Hitler's birthday, it would have been most impolite had the Western air forces not joined the Führer to celebrate. During the day there were constant air attacks, adding to the misery of the Soviet artillery strikes. The transport only had 10 kilometres to travel, but in these circumstances it needed to constantly seek shelter and so was delayed quite considerably. At the airfield, the pilots must have been fretting about the delay as they needed to fly under the cover of darkness because of the danger from Allied fighter planes. An RAF raid on the capital started at 2200 hours and lasted until around 0200 the following morning. How should the pilots fly in these circumstances? Schulz wanted to gain altitude in order to make the best use of cloud cover, whilst Gundelfinger preferred to be close to the ground. The trucks and passengers made it to the airfield around an hour or so before first light. Arndt organised the loading of the trucks in Gundelfinger's aircraft. There were 16 people on this plane. Schulze took off first. Gundelfinger followed a few minutes later around 0500 on the morning of the 21st of April 1945. He had only around 30 minutes of darkness to fly in, nowhere near enough to get him anywhere near his destination, and his large, slow plane would have been an easy target. Schulze's plane had a problem and was unable to make the journey. Shortly after taking off, he realized that he was losing fuel due to a broken fuel pipe. He landed at Prague in order to refuel. He took off again and reached Einring at 0830. 8 planes of the 10 were already there, but Gundelfinger was yet to arrive. No news of the plane was available. This was reported to Hans Bauer in Berlin. Bauer in turn reported this to Hitler. Bauer later recounted that Hitler became very pale, and when asked which plane was missing, Bauer said it was the one with Arndt on board, at which Hitler appeared very upset and said, "In that plane were all my private archives that I had intended as a testament to posterity. It is a catastrophe." "After I'd seen how much that affected the Führer," said Bauer, "I tried to calm him and explain that Gundelfinger was an old fox from the First World War and that the Americans wouldn't have got him that easily. Probably he'd made an emergency landing somewhere. But we didn't know, and our investigations had no success at all." It needs to be pointed out that Bauer himself offered no clue as to what was in those trunks. He died in 1993 and so was available to comment on the incidents which were to occur more than 30 years later and which will be the subject of future videos. Gundelfinger's plane was later reported to have crashed in the Bavarian forest, but this was inaccurate. What exactly happened to Gundelfinger's plane is not clear, but we do know where it ended up. After around 50 minutes flying, it either came into contact with an Allied fighter plane or was hit by friendly fire in the region of Dresden or Pirna. The plane came down in flames south of the village of Bernersdorf in the Heidenholt forest, close to the border with Czechoslovakia. As the plane fell, it hit the tops of the trees in the forest, and 3 of its 4 engines were pulled off before ploughing into the ground, sliding across on its metal belly whilst in a violent blaze. As the conflagration in the plane raged, some passengers were clearly still alive, frantically trying to get out of the inferno. SS guard Gerhard Becker pulled himself out of the plane but died of his injuries 2 days later. The plane's rear gunner, Franz Westermeier, managed to pull himself out, cursing the lack of assistance from the people on the ground. Westermeier survived the war and lived until April 1980, dying of a kidney tumour. As farm workers and villagers ran to the scene of the accident, others tried to pull the bodies out as best they could, despite the heat from the fire. The bodies were put to one side before being taken to a local morgue. On one body, a cigarette case embossed with the symbol of Lufthansa and the words of "in memory of 500,000 kilometers flying" was found. Clearly, this had belonged to the pilot, Gundelfinger, who despite his long service on the Eastern Front had died at the very end of the war whilst flying out of the danger zone. The remains of the plane were soon cordoned off, but because of the nature of the crash, debris and pieces of luggage were scattered all over the forest. As for Operation Seraglio, it didn't have any purpose. The Alpine Redoubt did not come about as Hitler chose neither to fight nor to flee, but instead to use the lives of tens of thousands of people to permit him a few extra days on the planet 18 meters below Berlin. 10 days later, Hitler killed himself. Shortly afterwards, the Americans captured what was left of the planned Alpine Redoubt without too much trouble. What, therefore, could have been in those metal trunks? What did Hitler lose that was intended as his testament to posterity? Well, if you'd like my interpretation of what Hitler got so upset about, I would have to guess that was the loss of the recordings of his meetings which he'd ordered to be made. This was his effort to excuse himself and to blame generals for not following his orders, which was the why defeats occurred. Obviously that wouldn't have weighed half a ton, so there'd been other stuff in there as well. Of course, that is just a guess. I wasn't in the bunker and I didn't see it loaded. For all I know, it might have contained Hitler's paintings, the third edition of Mein Kampf, his book on women, and his private diaries. So whatever it was, find out in the next enthralling episode. Of course, if you can't be bothered to wait for me to write the next part, you could try watching Selling Hitler, a link for which is provided below, or read Robert Harris's brilliant book of the same name, upon which the film series was based. Or alternatively, or as well, you could read the 1991 book by Charles Hamilton called The Hitler Diaries, which gives a different approach to the whole saga. So, if you subscribe, you'll know when my next part goes up. Thanks very much for listening.